Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hi, I'm your host, Don Cornegas, and joining me to introduce today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the double secret selection committee that selects all the guests who appear on STEM Talk.
Hi, Don. Great to be here. Today, we have Dr. Jeff Volek, who for the past 3 decades has been investigating how humans adapt to ketogenic and other carbohydrate-restricted diets. Jeff is a professor in the Department of Human Sciences at Ohio State University. He was our guest on STEM Talk back in 2017.
And much of Jeff's research focuses on the clinical application of ketogenic diets and the management of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And he's also known for research into a ketogenic diet's role in improving athletic performance and recovery. And his research particularly aims to understand individual variability, including how well-formulated ketogenic diets alter fatty acid composition, lipoprotein metabolism, gut microbiome, gene expression, adaptations to training, and just overall metabolic health in general.
But before we get to our interview with Jeff, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk. And we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews.
As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing iTunes, Google, Stitcher, and other podcast apps for the wittiest and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. If you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review comes from Steve, who describes himself as an avid listener. The review is titled, I Just Love STEM Talk. It reads, I'm a science nerd, and a ketogenic diet has normalized my type 2 diabetes and hypertension. I have listened to lots of podcasts about this topic over the past 5 years, and STEM Talk is consistently the best.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, and thanks to all of our other STEM Talk listeners who helped STEM Talk become such a great success.
Okay, and now on to today's interview with Dr. Jeff Volek.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. Hi, welcome to STEM Talk. I'm your host, Don Cornegas, and joining us today is Jeff Volek. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Really looking forward to this, Don.
And also joining us is Ken Ford.
Hello, Don, and hello, Jeff. Well, Jeff, you were last, I believe, on STEM Talk in 2017. And that seems like that can't be true. Our lives are just flying by. But for nearly 30 years now, you've been investigating how humans adapt to carbohydrate-restricted diets. And really, you've generated, I think, more scientific data and published more research on ketogenic diets than I think anyone I know of. Most STEM Talk listeners are at least somewhat familiar with your research. However, they may not know that you were once quite an accomplished competitive powerlifter, and you really achieved some remarkable numbers at a relatively low body weight. What were your best lifts? Squat, bench, deadlift? What was your favorite, and at what body weight were you doing this? And did your experience as a powerlifter sort of motivate you to become interested in exercise physiology, which you later studied?
Well, you're getting right into it, Ken. That's really personal. Agreed, though. This has been an amazing 5-6 years, I guess, since I was last on. There was a lot to share back in 2017, but boy, has the last 5 years been quite remarkable in terms of the advancements in the science. So I really look forward to getting into that. Yeah, so powerlifting, I enjoyed powerlifting a lot for many years. This was quite a while ago. I competed back in my late 20s, early 30s. That was while I was a doctoral student at Penn State and as an assistant professor at Ball State in Indiana. It was fun, and I guess I was okay at it. I'm probably not the most genetically gifted strength athlete, but I did train smart because I was learning at the time about exercise physiology and the state of the art in terms of training. So I was very scientific in my approach, and I was very fortunate to have some really awesome coaches and training partners at that time. So I was able to win a few meets, and I competed in the 82.5 kg, which is a 181 pound weight class for most of that time. And it's kind of funny thinking back. At the time, I never felt like I was really strong because there's, always somebody a heck of a lot stronger. But now at the age of 54, boy, I look back at my lifts and I can only dream of doing half of that. So, if you're really going to push me, I was a really good squatter and deadlifter, and I'd prefer not to talk about my bench.
Well, Jeff, it does seem as if there's beginning to be a paradigm shift in terms of low-carb diets, and especially around the perceived safety of fat. And as we know, when we've talked about in the past, Americans have long been led to believe that saturated fat made you fat and caused heart disease and was just about the worst thing in the world that you could eat. But over the past 20 years or so, there's been a steady accumulation of studies that support carbohydrate restriction and also the safety of dietary fat. And there's an example. You recently had a paper in Science that was titled Dietary Fat from Foe to Friend, and also a paper in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology that was titled Saturated Fats and Health, a Reassessment and Proposal for Food-Based Recommendations. So, Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about this work and what our listeners should be taking away from it?
Sure. Yeah, you're right, Don. There has been a steady accumulation of studies supporting carbohydrate restriction over the last 2 decades. It's funny and a bit sad because ketogenic diets and low-carb diets, they're still described as a fad by many in the field, but there are orders of magnitude more positive published studies on low-carb nutrition than vegetarian diets or just about any other eating pattern. For example, there are around 2,000 clinical trials published to date on low-carb diets, if you look at PubMed. I mean, it's really amazing the critical mass of studies supporting low-carb and even the more restrictive ketogenic diets. And yet this research has been, for the most part, completely ignored by policymakers. For example, there's no option for a low-carb eating pattern in the dietary guidelines for Americans. So yeah, this is, this message needs to really get out there, and the JACC article in particular was a powerful piece. JACC is a preeminent journal in cardiology. So just to have this published in that type of, mainstream journal that most cardiologists deem as very respectable, was quite an accomplishment. But the article, essentially completely debunked the 50-year dogma that saturated fat should be limited because it causes harmful effects in terms of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, etc. And this flawed thinking has been the cornerstone of our dietary guidelines. It's driven the food industry over the last 50 years in terms of all the, low-fat, fat-free products that were introduced into the marketplace. It's, affected public food programs, and therefore it's affected the eating patterns of all Americans. And what was probably most remarkable about this article is it wasn't just written by a bunch of scientists that had published previously on positive effects of low-carb diets. There were several authors, highly prestigious scientists, including 3 or 4 that I recall, who actually had previously been on the Dietary Guidelines Committee or even chaired the committee in one case. And essentially they were signing on to this piece that was making the case that, they had essentially been wrong about saturated fat being harmful. So this is just another kink in the armor, if you will, of the flawed dietary policies that we've had in this country, really demonizing saturated fat.
Well, speaking of demonizing saturated fat, I understand that at one point in your life, you were a strong advocate for low-fat diets, but not anymore. You went through a sort of shift in view there, obviously. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, unfortunately, that's true. It was a brief time early in my career where, not surprisingly, I was indoctrinated into the low-fat dogma as I was, training as a dietitian and undergraduate. I mean, this is what all my professors and all the experts were promoting at the time. So, I was a victim. I think that's an appropriate term, like most other Americans who were brainwashed into thinking fat was the enemy. This is what I was taught to believe, and this is what we tell other people to believe. So it's not surprising. It's not their fault in most cases. I was obsessed at the time, in modifying recipes to take out the fat and trying to get it as low as possible in my diet. And, it never really worked for me. I had questions about it. And as I started graduate school and started to learn how to critically think and evaluate scientific literature is when I really started to challenge what I was taught as a dietitian. And that really, began, quite a fascinating journey as I jumped into this rabbit hole of low-carb nutrition. very early in my career. I guess, I was training as a doctoral student in nutrition and exercise physiology.
So, Jeff, when we interviewed you back in 2017, you were in the early stages of launching Virta, and that's a company that was founded in 2014 to address the type 2 diabetes epidemic that we're seeing not only here in the United States, but also around the world. And more than 37 million Americans have diabetes, and approximately 90 to 95% of them have type 2 diabetes. And then around the world, the number of people with diabetes rose from 108 million in 1980 to 422 million in 2014. And that was the year that Virta was founded. So before we talk about the progress that Virta is making, can you take a moment to explain what type 2 diabetes is, and then also how it's different than type 1 diabetes?
Yeah. This has been a focus of my research over the last couple of decades, and it's, those are staggering numbers. It's hard to overstate how bad the diabetes problem is worldwide. In the U.S. alone, as you said, we're approaching 40 million people with diabetes. But, what's even more alarming, I think, is that over 3 times that many people have prediabetes. So well over 100 million people total, or half of U.S. adults, either have diabetes or they're on the fast track to developing it. So we have a real crisis on our hands here. I've, heard statistics that, every 23 seconds, another person is diagnosed with diabetes in the U.S. And every 2 minutes, diabetes contributes to another death in the U.S. It's a huge problem that causes a lot of suffering, but it's also extremely expensive. We spend well over $300 billion per year treating diabetes in this country. So it has the potential to bankrupt, some other countries. And it's certainly a burden on our healthcare costs. So this is a colossal crisis. But the good news is we have the tools to really address this problem. We can, in fact, have a dramatic effect in bending this curve. But to your question about, what is type 2 diabetes and how it differs from type 1. So type 2 diabetes, as you said, is by far the most predominant type of diabetes. And at its core, type 2 diabetes is a problem of insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is incredibly complex at the cellular level. But for simplicity, I describe it and think of it as a form of carbohydrate intolerance. So in other words, people who are insulin resistant do not metabolize or process carbohydrates in a healthy way. So when you think about solutions and countermeasures to this, it's logical, if you're carbohydrate intolerant, to limit carbs, just like you would limit lactose if you're lactose intolerant, or you'd limit gluten if you're gluten intolerant. However, conventional medicine has mostly ignored that sort of logical and rational approach to treating diabetes in favor of trying to facilitate the body to make more insulin, or provide it indirectly through drugs that stimulate the pancreas to make more insulin. And these approaches historically have not made the condition better. In fact, this is why we typically or historically describe type 2 diabetes as a chronic, progressive, and irreversible disease. And we know, or rather, we now have definitive proof that this is not true. Type 2 diabetes can indeed be reversed for many people, and they can keep it in remission with a well-formulated ketogenic diet. And this is really what Virta was all about, helping the tens of millions of people suffering from type 2 diabetes, as well as prediabetes, better manage their disease.
A lot of people do not seem aware that diabetes is such a major problem. And in particular, it's a leading cause of blindness, kidney failure, heart attack, stroke, and lower limb amputation, and also death. Do you know how many people annually succumb to diabetes each year? This must be a hard number to get, because diabetes contributes to all kinds of other diseases, and the cause of death might not officially be diabetes. Do you have any thoughts on this?
No, you're exactly right, Ken. You don't pass away from diabetes. It over time leads to a lot of complications that affect the nervous system and lead to dialysis, to amputations, to blindness. But the major complications that ultimately lead to death are heart failure, as well as chronic kidney disease. So it is a bit of a hard number to put your finger on, but I think, conservatively, we're talking about 100,000 deaths, a couple 100,000 deaths per year, likely attributed to diabetes. So it's a significant number for sure.
Yeah, and you can easily appreciate why that's a hard number to come up with.
So, Jeff, Virta's website describes the company's program as, this is unquotes, blood sugar control without the drugs. And Virta works with diabetics to not only lower their blood sugar, but also to help them lose weight and eliminate their need for insulin and other medications, and also overall to restore their metabolic health. And so for listeners who aren't that familiar with Virta, can you provide an overview of the company and the progress that you all are making?
Yeah, I mean, Virta was founded to really focus on, helping people control blood sugar. So those with diabetes and pre-diabetes. We were founded in 2014. And at that point in time, we had, very convincing evidence from clinical trials and laboratory work that we had done that we could do this, at least in a controlled laboratory setting. So what was new and exciting about Virta was that we were translating that clinical evidence, and building a company to scale it and help people all over the country, which, is obviously was a desperate need in terms of better treatments. So, the original thought behind Virta was that we could teach people, how to formulate, how to implement a ketogenic diet in their lives. And we would provide in-person education, various numbers of sessions over several months and years. But at the very early stages of the company, and this is really our CEO, Sami Inkinen's, vision to reach many more people, was that we would do this virtually. So the company is very much, based in really two cutting edge technologies, one being, telemedicine, the virtual care model of delivery, where we can basically put a health coach in everyone's pocket because our intervention is being delivered through an app where people have 24-hour access to a health coach and they're being monitored by a qualified physician. And the other, technology being sort of the cutting edge nutritional biochemistry underlying the ketogenic diet. And so it's really the marriage of the two that was, I think, really unique and timely that has led to the success of Virta. And that includes, proving that we can actually reverse diabetes in a clinical trial. But more importantly, we're doing it in the real world. We now have several hundred customers, which are mainly large private businesses who, are self-insured. But we're also now working with insurance companies and doing this outside of highly controlled laboratory clinical setting, but actually reversing diabetes and saving money and improving well-being, in real people that need this. And we're doing it, as you said, while we're getting people off expensive medications. So we're improving their blood sugar control and many other biomarkers and well-being without adding more drugs. In fact, we're taking away many drugs like insulin and sulfonylureas and oftentimes blood pressure medications that people just simply don't need once they're adapted to the ketogenic diet.
It's just incredible work. And you all have had a number of recent papers and trials that have demonstrated just absolutely incredible results. And last year, there was a paper in Nutrients that reported on the results of a 2-year pilot study that highlighted the effectiveness and the sustainability of Virta's intervention in reversing a variety of different metabolic conditions. And in that study, Virta was able to help 97% of its pre-diabetic patients in the 2-year study avoid type 2 diabetes. And that's just truly impressive and awesome work. So we're going to have Virta's Director of Research, Dr. Amy McKenzie, on STEM Talk in the near future to talk about this 2-year trial and other work that Virta is doing. But as the Chief Science Officer of Virta, I'm guessing that you must be very pleased with the outcomes that you're seeing in Virta's trials and studies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's really have to pinch myself sometimes because, the science and the application of this, I never dreamed would reach this many people. So I'm incredibly encouraged by the science and the real world application of what Virta's built. Dr. McKenzie will be really the right person to get into the nuances of what Virta's doing in terms of their research portfolio and some of the really exciting results. But, the company initially, was very focused on type 2 diabetes, and we still are, because that's where the majority of expenses are in terms of preventing dialysis and preventing other complications attributed to diabetes that are very, really cost the healthcare system a lot of money. But preventing diabetes is equally important. So this particular publication you referred to was some research that Virta conducted that demonstrated that we can not only reverse diabetes, but we can prevent it. So it is essentially a prevention as well as a potently therapeutic treatment option for those with diabetes.
Well, now let's turn to discuss some of your more recent work at Ohio State University. You joined the university back in 2014, and in the past decade, you've established the Volek Low Carbohydrate Laboratory. Can you give us an overview of the lab and the research that goes on there before we dive into some specific projects?
Sure. I've been at OSU now a little over 8 years. Prior to that, I was at the University of Connecticut for 14 years, doing low-carb ketogenic research there as well. My goal in coming to OSU was to exponentially expand my past low-carb work by making paradigm-shifting advances in knowledge and really aimed at breaking open new applications of nutritional ketosis. Our vision is to be a beacon that attracts the best minds in ketogenic research to speed the pace of discovery and its translational impact to improve the human condition. We have a pretty small group, but we're highly productive. We really strive to be the epicenter of ketogenic knowledge generation, as well as application, and to change, how the world views therapeutic nutrition. These are lofty goals, but we've made significant headway in achieving them over the last 8 years. As a broad overview, we currently have over a dozen active IRB protocols related to ketogenic diet, as well as exogenous ketone studies. It's highly multidisciplinary, so we collaborate with many other departments, colleges, centers across the OSU campus, as well as other institutions, like yours, Ken. Grateful to be working collaboratively with IHMC to carry out this work. Currently, we have multiple ketogenic diet studies in various types of cancer. We're performing controlled study of a ketogenic diet in people with major depression. This is kind of our first work in the area of mental health, which is really exciting. We have multiple studies underway testing various exogenous ketone formulations, kinetic responses, metabolic physiological outcomes. And then our recent Department of Defense funding has provided the opportunity to go in some different directions. We are currently conducting well-powered studies of both ketogenic diet and the ketone esters in various clinical populations, from those with heart failure and polycystic kidney disease, expanding all the way to studying potential effects of achieving ketosis in military personnel and how it might counteract decrements attributed to sleep restriction in terms of shooting performance, physical, cognitive abilities, etc. So we really cover a lot of ground in terms of different applications, underlying physiology, truly, translational in our view of, how to study these ketogenic approaches.
That's exciting, and we'll come back to several of those projects in more detail in a few minutes.
Really exciting work. And in addition to your research, the lab also has a team of registered dietitians who work with clients on a variety of approaches to low-carb and ketogenic diets. And I'm going to suspect this is because there's no, one-size-fits-all plan when it comes to nutrition. Can you walk listeners through some of those services that the lab provides in that context?
Yeah, I have an outstanding team, including dietitians and other people that are, very well trained in the fundamental principles of a well-formulated ketogenic diet and implementing and supporting people in achieving ketosis. Taryn Bedell is kind of my lead dietitian. She's been with me pretty much the entire time I've been at Ohio State. And, she's just an incredible asset to the team. So she, in addition to managing all the dietetic logistics, manages all sorts of other demanding aspects of the research, as well as recently minted PhD level research scientists in my lab now, Madison Cockley. They really manage all our clinical trials and research. But Taryn in particular manages our sort of outreach component, which is part of our earnings operation, where we do provide services to help people, educate them on the ketogenic diet, support them, coach them, counsel them, because there's a great need, a great unmet need for that, because no curriculum that I'm aware of for dietitians or other healthcare professionals exists. So no one's really taught this in school in terms of how to implement a ketogenic diet. So to serve that unmet need, we thought we should at least provide some services along those lines just to help some of the people that always come to us saying, where can I get help? So we thought, well, why don't we be part of the solution here? So it's a small part of what we do, as we really primarily focus on research, but we do have that sort of outreach piece that helps people who want to learn more about ketogenic nutrition.
A lot of people have it in their mind when they think of the ketogenic diet, they immediately adequate it almost strictly with weight loss. And of course, it's very effective for weight loss. You often stress, however, that a well-formulated ketogenic diet results not only in weight loss, but also leads to substantial improvements in insulin resistance, as well as improvements in a number of cardiometabolic biomarkers that are typically associated with metabolic syndrome. Can you talk about the wide range of benefits people can experience as a result of a ketogenic diet? I know there's a lot of individual variability here, but if you could touch on some of that, that would be good.
Yeah, I mean, I guess first of all, I'd like to address this model, if you will, or thinking around obesity, being a cause of diabetes, for example, or a cause of other chronic disease. Simply because obesity is correlated with higher risk of developing diabetes or heart disease doesn't mean it's a causative factor. So it's not proof. And everyone, I think, or a lot of people are familiar with this concept that correlation does not equal causality. And so, there are obviously obese people who are healthy, and it's corollary, thin people who may not be diabetic or have unhealthy metabolic health. So, obesity does not happen spontaneously. There are inputs that create the condition. For most forms of obesity, that input involves overconsumption of carbs relative to their tolerance. So in other words, excessive carb intake is what drives the insulin-resistant and diabetic condition for most people. And along with that, excessive accumulation of fat often develops. So obesity is not the cause of diabetes. It often happens in parallel with other metabolic impairments attributed, though, to the excessive consumption of carbs. And so this is just a really different way of thinking of obesity as not the stimulus that causes obesity. It may result more from an overconsumption of carbs, which drives both obesity and diabetes. And when you think in the reverse, then restricting carbs, it does improve weight, ability for many obese people to lose weight, but it's not a requirement. So you will see, for example, a lot of metabolic improvement when you restrict carbs, even if you are eating calories to a level that allows you to maintain your weight. And we've shown this now, in multiple studies where people maintain weight and they still see dramatic improvements in a lot of the cardiometabolic risk factors. And we've also shown, even in studies where there's weight loss, when you have two comparative diets, low fat versus low carb, and you match for weight loss, you see superior benefits of the low carb approach. So clearly, weight loss is a benefit. It's an important and consistent benefit for people who are overweight, but it's happening as more of a side benefit, and it's not a requirement to elicit the other positive metabolic improvements you see with carb restriction.
Jeff, as you said earlier, this is an exciting time in terms of research and the growing acceptance of low-carb and ketogenic diets. And back in 2018, you and Ken and some other folks put together a symposium at Ohio State. I was also there on a panel that addressed the remarkable progress that's been made in the science of low-carbohydrate nutrition. So can you talk about the symposium, and also what were some of the key takeaways from that meeting?
Yeah, this was an amazing event. It's hard to believe took place almost 5 years ago. As the organizer, along with Ken and other some amazing folks, our goal was to showcase and spotlight the plethora of research on low-carb nutrition and nutritional ketosis across multiple disciplines. We had a couple dozen experts that we invited from all over the world speak on topics ranging from basic mechanisms of ketones to clinical applications for diabetes and dyslipidemia, cancer, neurology, and even human performance. And, within a few days of opening registration, as I recall, we sold out our venue, which we were somewhat limited by only being able to accommodate a couple hundred people, but just huge level of interest in the topic. And, looking back now, by all measures, this 2-day conference was a smashing success with highly innovative presentations by all the speakers. And what was really unique is just a highly engaged audience and really lively and informative Q&A session after all the talks. It took a lot of effort to coordinate this event, as it does with any, kind of scientific conference and meeting. But we definitely need a follow-up event because there have been so many new publications and advancements in the science and application of ketogenic diets since that meeting. But I will say at the time, so this is 2018, there was so much to talk about in terms of the positive results of many ketogenic diet studies that, a major outcome was just increasing awareness, because this is not necessarily what people think, what the media portrays, that, that there's this much science out there supporting low-carb ketogenic approaches. So I think we were successful in reaching a lot of people, convincing them this is a highly credible topic. It has tremendous therapeutic potential to help a lot of people. Yet there's still a lot of work to be done because we're overcoming 50 years of brainwashing and indoctrination and, basically keeping all this research in the shadows. So we were successful, but more work to do in terms of getting the message out to folks and changing the paradigm.
We will be sure to include a link in our show notes to a page that's titled The Emerging Science of Carbohydrate Restriction and Nutritional Ketosis. And that page features a number of really excellent videos from the symposium, from the panels and the presentations. And I agree, Jeff, it was a wonderful meeting.
So this is probably a really good time to talk about some of your lab's specific research projects and dig in just a little bit more. And Jeff, for more than 2 decades, you've been researching how a very low carbohydrate, high fat diet impacts human health. And lately, you've begun looking at a variety of other chronic disease conditions beyond type 2 diabetes. And as you've talked about a little bit already, that includes mental health, heart disease, and cancer. And you've been looking at, whether a ketogenic diet can have a therapeutic impact there on any of those different conditions. So let's start with cancer specifically. Can you share with listeners how research has shown that the majority of tumors use glucose as their primary fuel source?
Yeah. Cancer is a really complicated disease that demonstrates a lot of variability between individuals, and that makes treatment more challenging. There has been historically and even more contemporary views of cancer really highlight the genetics, which to some extent has overshadowed the metabolic basis of tumor growth. And it's well established that many, not all, but I'd say most tumors do rely on a steady source of glucose for fuel to grow and metastasize. And, as previously mentioned, one of the main features of a ketogenic diet is to switch metabolism from one that is reliant mostly on glucose to one that predominantly uses fat for fuel. So if you have a tumor that is, primarily reliant on glucose to grow, the idea, or at least one idea behind the ketogenic diet, is that you could starve the tumor, but allow nourishment of the rest of the body by virtue of providing adequate fat and ketones to supply a steady source of fuel for the rest of the organs and tissues in the body. Now, this may be a bit of an oversimplification, but in general, the theory does have merit. But I would point out that there are many other aspects of the ketogenic diet that could elicit beneficial effects on tumor metabolism and overall host health. We know that, for example, the ketogenic diet is anti-inflammatory. It reduces oxidative stress. We now know that the principal ketone body, beta-hydroxybutyrate, is a potent signaling molecule. It affects gene expression. It upregulates antioxidant genes. And all of these sort of pleiotropic mechanisms of action could have a positive effect in the context of tumor growth and cancer. So this is what makes the ketogenic diet so exciting as a potential adjunct to other treatments in managing different types of cancer.
In fact, on an earlier episode of STEM Talk, I think it was Colin Champ discussed this in some length.
Yes, Colin Champ's certainly at the bleeding edge of the ketogenic diet cancer research.
Yeah, that was a good interview, I think. Right now, you have a couple pilot ketogenic diet cancer studies already underway, and you've completed a pilot study that is specifically looking at advanced stage breast cancer. Can you share what you found in these studies thus far?
So far, you're right. We've completed a relatively small single-arm 20-patient study in women with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, and that was really our first study in the cancer realm. We've been a little slow in getting all that data analyzed and written up, but we are in the process of finalizing that manuscript, which we will be submitting this year. So I can't share, all the detail, but I will provide some general conclusions from that. So first of all, women were very, I guess I'll use the term, willing to enroll in this study. They just really embraced, and I would say empowered by the ketogenic diet. And a lot of the women expressed the fact that they felt like for the first time they were taking part in their treatment because, this was something they could work on and do that was, potentially having a beneficial effect on their outcome. So the women certainly embraced the diet, and they were able to adapt to the diet as demonstrated by ketone levels. So they were all in a nutritional state of ketosis, and most of them experienced dramatic weight loss. So we overall, had significant weight loss and improved their body composition. This was a 6-month study. So weight loss in body composition improved significantly at 3 months and was sustained at 6 months. They also demonstrated improvements in blood sugar levels, which is really an important outcome that often predicts poor prognosis, if you have uncontrolled blood sugar levels. And then we did do some imaging, and there were a subset of women that demonstrated a partial response in terms of some of the tumor burden, and we're still processing some of that data. But overall, this was primarily a feasibility study, and by all measures, the implementation of the diet was shown to be feasible, and women adapted to the diet in a normal way that you'd expect in terms of the metabolic responses. And then you mentioned a couple other pilot studies, so I'll just say those are in the very early stages. We're in one case now just enrolling subjects. These are patients with brain metastases. So this is also this one's a 24-week study where we're either randomizing them to a ketogenic diet or a more traditional low-fat diet that's promoted by most cancer institutions. And we've enrolled, I think, 6 patients now. So again, very early stages. And then we're getting off the ground with getting IRB protocol approved for another project as well, and patients on immunotherapies, specifically patients with renal cell carcinoma and metastatic melanoma.
And it's just fascinating work that you guys are doing. And switching lanes a little bit here, talking about weight loss. And although weight loss is a common outcome of consuming a ketogenic diet, there's a question that's been rather controversial in the research community, and that's whether or not there are metabolic improvements as a result of carbohydrate restriction that's independent of weight loss. And you had a study, Jeff, that was published last year in the Journal of Clinical Investigation Insight that found more than half of your obese study participants who were suffering from metabolic syndrome no longer met the criteria for metabolic syndrome at the end of a 4-week low carbohydrate diet, even though the participants didn't shed any weight. So even without weight loss, a low carbohydrate diet seems to improve a host of metabolic problems. And that was a really significant finding. Can you give us some of the background of the study and then also talk about the significance of your findings?
Yeah, this really comes back to the obesity being a driver of diabetes and other chronic diseases question. But this was, I would say, really the definitive study that proved that you don't need to have weight loss for low-carb diets to manifest in significant benefit in terms of metabolic outcomes. So this was a bear of a study. This was actually a crossover study, and it was a highly controlled feeding study where we weighed every ounce of food that people ate. So each participant, and these were all obese participants, so they had excess accumulation of fat and needed to lose weight. But we intentionally prevented them from losing weight, and we provided all their food for 4 weeks on 3 different diets. And so they were on either a traditional high-carb diet, and then we had a more moderate low-carb, non-ketogenic diet, and then we had a very low-carb diet, so kind of 3 levels of carb intake. All matched for calories, all matched for protein. We just manipulated carbs and fat. So just from the implementation and execution perspective, this was just a huge effort to carry out in terms of the dietetic demands and so forth. But we were successful in pulling this off. And as you said, the results showed that these patients that were all overweight or obese with metabolic syndrome completed the 3 interventions. And we were able to show with the low-carb approach, they experienced dramatic improvement in their metabolic health, despite preventing them from losing weight. So we removed the weight loss variable completely. And so we're seeing effects here, differential effects based on the macronutrient composition. So, one of the big sort of sound bites you hear is that a calorie is a calorie. And this study clearly disproves that. So, we matched calories were matched, but we're seeing dramatically different effects based on the quality of the calories. So low carb results in better results than high carb in terms of the features of metabolic syndrome. And, that's what the paper was all about. And it's really taking on this decades long thinking that it doesn't matter the quality of the calories. It's a matter of just restricting calories if you want to lose weight, for example. That's a tough ship to turn around, but this was, I think, clearly the best study that demonstrates, the most convincing study that demonstrates a calorie is not a calorie.
Yeah, I mean, in a physics sense, of course, a calorie is a calorie. But in terms of what the implications are for the human body, consuming different macronutrients would clearly make a big difference in the outcome. The other thing I like about this study is it pokes a big hole in the discussion. One still hears, actually, that, of course, the ketogenic diet improved all these biomarkers. They lost 30 pounds, and so they attribute the benefit entirely to the weight loss.
Exactly, yeah. In most studies, you want weight loss to happen, so it's not a bad thing.
Right.
but just from a demonstration of the model, you don't need the weight loss. It's the carb restriction that's driving improvement in metabolic health, which is probably in turn helping people achieve weight loss. So it's kind of changing the arrows, if you will, in the model.
Moving to another activity in your lab, we are particularly interested in some of the work that you and your colleagues are doing with the military. As you well know, here at HMC, we work with all branches of the military. In fact, we've done a number of studies looking at whether ketone esters, for example, might enhance and sustain the physical and cognitive performance of the warfighters. I know you share this interest and have done lots of interesting work for the military, and there'll be more in the future. A few years ago, you received funding to look into whether a ketogenic diet could help the military deal with what is really a major challenge for them, and this is, unfortunately, obesity among the troops. And this was an impressive study because the participants in your study lost, on average, 17 pounds after only 12 weeks on the ketogenic diet. And as a group, the participants lost more than 5% of their body fat and a shocking 44% of their belly or what's called visceral fat, and had a 48% improvement in insulin sensitivity. Can you tell us more about this study that was published in 2019 in the Journal of Military Medicine?
Sure. So this, prior to this study, we had demonstrated multiple times that a well-formulated ketogenic diet results in superior weight loss and improvements in a broad array of cardiometabolic risk factors. But we, or no one really, had demonstrated that a group of military-affiliated individuals could accept and adapt to a ketogenic diet. So we worked closely with the Ohio State University ROTC to conduct the study. We recruited primarily ROTC cadets who self-selected into either a ketogenic diet or a habitual high-carb diet group. And we trained both groups for 12 weeks, primarily with resistance trainings or strength-based training. And, again, the idea here was that, we would probably see what we had seen before in obese and diabetic and pre-diabetic populations. But, we needed to show this actually could happen in a military affiliated population. And as you highlighted, the results were quite extraordinary. So first of all, we were able to recruit these individuals without a problem. So there was high interest. Second of all, we were able to achieve a very high degree of compliance to the ketogenic diet as measured by daily ketones. So they were more than able to get into a state of nutritional ketosis. And they were able to train adequately during that time, because a lot of people think if you're not eating carbs, you can't train hard. So all of those things in terms of feasibility and acceptability and adaptability to the diet were demonstrated. And one other point is that the protocol that we use in studies, we don't prescribe calories in a lot of these free living studies. So we really enforce the low carb piece of it and monitor ketones, but we allow people to eat until they're full. So eat to satiety is what we say. So there was no recommendation to restrict calories, yet every single participant lost weight. And we measured body composition by, arguably the gold standard, DEXA, and they were able to demonstrate remarkable improvement in body composition as well. So they're actually, maintaining most of their lean mass while losing a lot of fat mass. And then we did a lot of measures of health and fitness and whatnot. And as you indicated, there was broad spectrum improvement there in insulin sensitivity and lipid biomarkers and so forth. They also demonstrated improvements in strength and power and some military specific testing protocols. And then in a separate publication, one of my doctoral students was interested in mitochondria. So we took muscle biopsies from these guys before and 12 weeks after the intervention and looked at mitochondrial function. And he demonstrated a significantly enhanced ability of mitochondria to oxidize fat, which is not too surprising considering we know that ketogenic diets dramatically elevate and accelerate fat metabolism. But this is really the first study that demonstrated it at the muscle cell level, as well as, improved or enhanced mitochondrial biogenesis. So there's greater mitochondrial protein content. So there's some nice underlying data that's expanded our understanding of the keto adaptation process in terms of specific muscle level adaptations. So overall, this was our one of our really first studies to get into how this ketogenic diet might benefit military populations.
Perhaps one of the most exciting projects you're undertaking right now is called Strategies to Augment Ketosis, or STAC for short. This is a comprehensive initiative that's going to address the physical and financial toll attributed to the pervasive poor metabolic health of the nation and how this impacts our military troops, especially veterans, and therefore poses a significant threat to the future of the military and our nation's defense. There are multiple layers of research involved in STAC, many of which will utilize ketone esters. First, though we have discussed this topic in depth in an earlier episode of STEM Talk, especially episode 54 with Brianna Stubbs, for our listeners, in brief, what are ketone esters?
Yeah, Dr. Stubbs is truly, the world expert on ketone esters. But yeah, briefly, so ketone esters, these are sort of a new and exciting category of some people will call them, I guess, supplements, but they're kind of almost also a new food group. And the ketone esters represent one particular formulation of these exogenous ketones that chemically involve either beta-hydroxybutyrate directly or a precursor that is chemically bound to a short-chain fatty acid through an ester bond. So that's where the ketone ester name comes from. And these are typically 6 carbon, 8 carbon fatty acids that are attached. So the ketone esters now have been shown to dramatically and consistently elevate circulating ketone levels transiently. So this really represents another strategy to augment ketosis, which is kind of where we came up with the acronym for our DoD proposal. So typically we've been studying the ketogenic diet, and now we're very interested too in this other method or strategy to augment ketosis.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
And Jeff, one of the topics that you'll be examining in STAC is sleep deprivation, and this is a major problem in military populations. And only 1 in 3 U.S. Army active duty soldiers are estimated to get their target of 7 hours of sleep on duty days. And so obviously this is a serious problem in the military because insufficient sleep has significant effects on human performance and even overall health. And because sleep loss leads to an inability to concentrate, it also leads to an increase in errors. And so there's some evidence that ketone ester supplements may lessen the adverse effects of sleep deprivation. So Jeff, can you talk a little bit about the clinical trial that you're putting together? And from what I understand, it will look at whether ingesting a ketone ester supplement twice daily can improve cognitive and also physical performance during short-term sleep restriction. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So this is one of the projects that is part of our multi-project stack proposal, and it involves two separate projects. One specifically looking at the ketone ester as a countermeasure to mitigate some of the decrements in both physical and cognitive performance attributed to sleep restriction. And then the other project, or sub-aim, if you will, is looking at the ketogenic diet as a countermeasure. So this will allow us to look at both methods of achieving beneficial levels of ketones on some of the different outcomes attributed to sleep restriction. But yeah, this is a huge problem in the military. It's a huge problem just in the general population. People are not getting adequate sleep. And it doesn't take, much sleep restriction to manifest in pretty significant declines in cognitive function and physical function. So our protocol that we developed involves short-term sleep restriction. And this is based off some of the classic studies done at Walter Reed with sleep restriction. So we're limiting sleep to 50% of normal for 4 consecutive nights. So if someone normally sleeps 8 hours, we'd only allow them to sleep 4 hours. And this will lead to significant drops in physical and cognitive performance. And our hypothesis is that either augmenting ketosis via the ketone ester or the ketogenic diet will attenuate some of those decrements. And we've developed some interesting testing protocols to try to make them specific and more meaningful to the military. So for example, we have a shoot house or a virtual shooting setup where we can look at marksmanship and various parameters around accuracy, precision, and so forth, as well as looking at several different measures of cognitive function and ability to make, appropriate decisions under stress. So, this project is just getting underway, so I can't share any results right now, but we're quite hopeful and thinking that our hypotheses are solidly grounded here, that there should be a benefit attributed to ketones. But stay tuned in terms of some of those outcomes. Hopefully we'll have soon.
Jeff, what was the basis for the expectation of the benefit in this case?
It's not entirely clear exactly the sort of pathophysiology around sleep restriction and how it's affecting performance, but various mechanisms have been proposed that either involve metabolic impairment. There's evidence that just, short-term sleep restriction causes glucose intolerance and, somewhat insulin resistant phenotype. There's also interest in inflammation, that sleep restriction causes neuroinflammation, and that affects systemic processes that impact cognitive physical performance. So it could be that the ketogenic diet is counteracting, those pathways in terms of glucose metabolism and inflammation, which we have a pretty good database and, evidence-based shows ketogenic diets improve insulin sensitivity and knock down inflammation. So those are two possible pathways. There's also a number of ways just by which ketones directly impact cerebral metabolism and neural pathways that could be impacting cognition on different levels, getting into some of the neurology evidence that suggests clinical benefits in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so forth. So there just could be better fuel flow in the brain that translates into cognitive benefits. So not sure, and we won't be drilling too deep on cellular mechanisms, but it's a much more of a translational research study. So like, most things, there's not a simple pathway that is targeted, typically by ketones. They're just working through so many different cellular signaling pathways, and they change metabolism and physiology in such robust ways that, it's not easy to explain if you're a reductionist. It's pleiotropic and multifaceted in terms of how you're changing cellular functioning.
So, Jeff, another element of STACK is exploring the effect of ketone esters and also the sustained long-term effects of a ketogenic diet on type 2 diabetes and heart failure. And so heart failure is a major cause of morbidity and mortality in people with diabetes. What can you tell us about this study that you'll be undertaking? And can you also please tell us why you think ketones in particular would be beneficial for the heart?
Well, this is a really fascinating area that's just exploded in the last 5 years. There are numerous lines of evidence now pointing to ketones being a preferred fuel for the heart. I mean, we've kind of known this for the brain for a while, even though it's understudied and underfunded, but it's a much newer in the heart. So the heart, just like the brain, will utilize ketones in proportion to their levels in the blood. And that's really not controversial. What's a little more debated now is, how that affects functioning of the heart. But like I said, there's a lot of evidence now, especially in the basic science. So, animal model studies show when the heart is fueled by ketones, it's more efficient, it functions better. And in particular, in the failing heart, it's even more evident. So this has really opened the eyes of cardiologists now who typically have been quite resistant to the idea that ketones in a ketogenic diet might be beneficial for heart failure patients, particularly because it's high fat, high saturated fat, are now taking another look. There's also evidence, with the SGLT2 inhibitor studies. I mean, these are drugs used to treat diabetes, but we now have several clinical trials, long-term clinical trials that demonstrate individuals on SGLT2 inhibitors that there's improvement in heart outcomes, cardiac events, hospitalizations in both heart failure patients with type 2 diabetes or without type 2 diabetes. So again, this is, clinical trial evidence now that a drug that, I should point out here, the important part here is that SGLT2 inhibitors work through some different mechanisms. They basically cause the kidneys to increase glucose output so that it lowers blood sugar. But one of the other effects is it increases ketones. It has a modest sort of ketogenic effect of these drugs. And many think could be, one of the reasons why they improve these outcomes, cardiac outcomes, is the increase in ketones. So again, just another layer of evidence that points to potential benefits of ketones in the heart. So the bottom line, though, is no one's really done a clinical trial in any patient population with heart disease. And that's one of the, heart failure in particular is one of the primary complications of type 2 diabetes. So we know we can have a positive benefit in type 2 diabetes through our work and many other investigators now. And so it's a logical extension, I think, in terms of the studies that need to be done to study a population specifically with heart failure. So that's what we've proposed to do, and it's part of this STACK proposal. We have additional funding so we can even make this study more robust. So we have a group of cardiologists, outstanding cardiologists at Ohio State who are completely on board and excited about this. And we are in the process of getting that study through final IRB and all the regulatory approvals so that we'll be recruiting this year. In fact, hopefully next quarter, we'll be in a position to start enrolling our first patients into that trial. And we'll see what the data show. I mean, we have to look at the evidence, but we're extremely excited for the first time to be able to potentially show benefits for a patient population in particular with what's called heart failure preserved ejection fraction. So heart failure is roughly categorized in two ways, either preserved or reduced ejection fraction. And the reduced ejection fraction, those are your patients who often have implantable devices and so forth that do, tend to work. So there's effective treatment options, but the preserved ejection fraction, there's not a lot of good treatments. So we're primarily focused in that particular subgroup of heart failure patients who also have some degree of glucose intolerance, either type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. And we'll share those results as soon as we have anything we can share.
I remember long ago talking to Richard Veach about this and about some animal work he and colleagues did with respect to ketone esters and cardiac function in, I think it was rodents. And it was very interesting. And then, as you mentioned, more recently, there's been several studies. John Newman, I know, was involved in one of them. I can't remember the name of the study, but it had to do with cardiac function and reducing pathologic remodeling in rodents with heart disease. Very interesting. I'm glad you're digging in on this with humans.
Yeah, Veach did really the, I think, initial study in an animal model where he showed I think it was a 25% improvement in efficiency. So greater cardiac output per unit oxygen when the heart was fueled by ketones. And that's more or less borne true in follow-up studies. And amazingly, there's been a couple human studies where one group in a patient population with heart failure, these were reduced ejection fraction. They infused ketones to a level of about 3, I think, to 4, 5 millimolar, which is achievable with ketone esters or ketogenic diet even, and showed acutely here. So this is, directly after the infusion at these levels that cardiac output improved by 2 liters per minute. And so we now, have human evidence that elevation of ketones transiently has a dramatically positive benefit on heart function. And I think that's been replicated in one study now with the ketone ester in a population with heart failure as well. And we have internal data that are also show a benefit. So, I mean, everything's lining up quite nicely, but no one's actually done a prospective clinical trial, that actually has people in ketosis over a period of weeks and months and demonstrated a sustained benefit. So that's what hopefully we'll be able to achieve in our work.
So another aspect of the STACK project, this is a very extensive project, is looking at the delay or prevention of the progression of diabetic nephropathy. And chronic kidney disease is present in more than 30% of veterans. This project seeks to evaluate a therapy which addresses the underlying factors that are common to both type 2 diabetes and chronic kidney disease, and the potential to prevent or delay progression of these diseases. And we know that ketones play an important role in providing energy to the kidney during stress. But Jeff, what can you tell us about the studies? It's really fascinating, and we're excited to hear about the results of it.
Yeah, I mean, just like heart failure, chronic kidney disease is another major complication of diabetes. And so that's the reason we're focused on it. And just like heart failure, there are a lot of reasons to think there's a positive effect on kidney function in the context of elevated ketones, but very little human trial studies. So again, we're in the early stages of getting this work off the ground, but it represents really the first attempt to specifically study how a ketogenic diet impacts chronic kidney disease and progression of the disease. And we've had a few changes in the protocol since we proposed it, but we're going to be focusing in particular on specific markers of kidney function over time on a ketogenic diet. And we're going to be doing a pilot study in a particular type of chronic kidney disease called polycystic kidney disease, or PKD. And we hypothesize that the ketogenic diet will have a beneficial effect, reduce cyst growth and progression of growth, and hopefully inspire others to pursue this. Because again, you don't pass away from diabetes, right? You end up with chronic kidney disease or heart failure. So we really have to start, I think, drilling down and understanding what happens over the long term in these particular areas that have not been studied over time on a ketogenic diet.
Well, STACK certainly sounds like a bold and expansive project with lots of interesting threads. You must be quite excited about it. Another area of research for your lab is focused on metabolic psychiatry. You mentioned it briefly earlier, and this is an area that I think is of expanding interest. We've known for a long time that food choices can alter a person's neurochemistry, but we are just now beginning to research the impact that the macronutrient ratio would have with respect to our mental and emotional well-being. Can you discuss this a little bit and also explain really what does metabolic psychiatry entail?
Yeah, so this is another really exciting area like heart failure, like chronic kidney disease. And there's a growing number of researchers, clinicians, psychiatrists in particular, who are embracing this idea. And they've kind of coined the term metabolic psychiatry. And I think right now that basically is primarily focused around the ketogenic diet as a metabolic therapy. And this is because of a lot of basic science that supports the theory, as well as a growing number of case studies and just general empirical, success of sort of pioneering psychiatrists like Chris Palmer, Shabani Sethi, for example, who are very successfully using this in practice to treat a range of conditions from bipolar and depression and so forth. So, a huge level of interest in this space, but like these other areas, virtually no credible human clinical trials. So a lot of the momentum behind this is from David and Jan Bazuki, who have really dedicated and are committed to funding research in this space, as well as just, sort of changing the perspective of, treatment in mental health, away, maybe from a focus on simply drugs and counseling, which can be effective, but, focusing on the metabolic aspects of it and the ketogenic diet in particular as a potential therapeutic approach. So, as a result of their, commitment and effort to support and fund research, there are a number of projects, some of them underway now, some of them in the planning phases. We're fortunate at Ohio State to be part of one of the projects and that are being done. And we're particularly focused on OSU students with major depression. And so we'll be doing a sort of a pilot feasibility and efficacy study in that particular group of students. And unfortunately, there's a whole lot of them. The statistics are just staggering in terms of the number of students suffering from anxiety and depression on campus. And it's probably not a big surprise, but it's another crisis we have for sure. And, we don't have the clinical trial data now, so I can't, say, that this is going to be the silver bullet, but I do think that a lot of these studies are likely to yield some really positive results. So it's just another case of stay tuned. I think very soon we'll have results from some of these trials, and my thinking and projection is that they're going to be positive studies, and that's really exciting. It opens up a whole new area of treatment.
Students might feel better if they didn't watch so much television.
Probably. One of many problems, right, Ken?
Yeah.
In academia.
It's increasingly a mess.
Yes.
So we've had a number of physicians and researchers on STEM Talk who are strong proponents of the ketogenic diet, but who also struggle to get their patients to stick to a strict ketogenic diet. And we recently had Boston-based physician Vivian Lowe on the podcast, who talked about how some of her patients struggle with the diet, and so she often ends up recommending a less stringent low-carb diet instead. And Jeff, as you know, one of the major criticisms of ketogenic diets is that it's not sustainable. So what are your thoughts about this?
Well, this is an incredibly important topic about the feasibility and sustainability of ketogenic diets. So there's no doubt it's different, and therefore it's challenging since you're limiting carbs in the context of a society where there are massive forces out there that want you to eat carbs. It's not surprising, this can be difficult. So yeah, people will struggle on it, but I don't think that the best approach is then to meet them where they're at and necessarily, fall back to just a low carb, non-ketogenic approach, because you may be missing out on where the real metabolic gold is, if you will. Because when you restrict carbs enough and keep protein in the right range to elevate ketones, that's when you tend to get the best therapeutic effects. I mean, that's still a bit of a debated question, what level of ketones might be optimal for treating different conditions, but I think there's reasonable evidence to suggest higher ketones tend to deliver better results, especially in diabetes. We have some data that support that at Virta, for example. So, my approach is generally don't give up on people, because if you provide adequate education, you teach people on the principles of a well-formulated ketogenic diet, which extend well beyond just limiting carbs. You can limit carbs perfectly, but if you don't get protein in the right range, you don't address the need for extra salt, you don't get the right types of fat and address the quality, it can sabotage your efforts. So first of all, giving people the right information is really important. And not a lot of people understand these principles, even within the low-carb community. So that's one part of it. The other part is providing the ongoing support and coaching and helping, people overcome the obstacles and hurdles that they'll encounter in daily life. And when you get all that right and you provide that support structure and the education, a lot of people can sort of thread the needle here and get very good compliance and elevate their ketones and keep them there over, periods of months and even years. Now, again, I will emphasize it's not easy. And if you just sort of, have people read a book and say, here, go do this. Most will fail. You do need the ongoing education and support, but we've clearly demonstrated that it is sustainable, and especially in our population of type 2 diabetes, where people in our clinical trial have been doing this for over 5 years in some cases. So it can be done, and it can be done in a way that is very satisfying and pleasurable and enjoyable, so that it is a true lifestyle and eating pattern that people adopt for their entire life, not just transiently to address a clinical condition. Because at least in the case of diabetes, if you have success with low carb and ketogenic approach, if you go back to eating your habitual diet, those results will all reverse, and you'll go back to being diabetic and needing insulin or needing medication to try to manage it.
The addiction of carbohydrates, and it's really glucose. It's kind of an addiction, right? So, I know somebody that lost 60, 70 pounds, and she looked fabulous doing the ketogenic diet, and, she's back where she was. She couldn't stick to it. And I think if she had had access to better coaching and some kind of a support system, she probably would have been able to stick to it. Right. But I recently saw her again, and it's like, wow, she's right back where she was, maybe worse.
Yeah. It's a little outside of my expertise, but I do think some people do have addictive-like responses chemically to carbs. In particular, they need the ongoing support, much like an alcoholic would, as they will constantly be tempted by carbs everywhere. But the ketogenic diet does help break that cycle, even in those people, so that when they become adapted to using fat and ketones as their primary fuels, you do have less of those, episodes
right,
where, they would be tempted to binge on carbohydrates to get that whatever dopamine response that they're getting.
In my personal experience, having been ketogenic for much of my adult life, I have zero in other words, that you hear people talk about, I long for this, I really miss my pasta or whatever. That goes away, at least in my case. In the case of others, I know that urge goes away. It doesn't mean you don't appreciate, say, an artisanally made, beautiful craftsman baked, some special French bread or something. It doesn't mean that you can't appreciate it, but you don't have this desire for it. It's sort of just not there.
Oh yeah, we've had so many participants and people we worked with say, I can't live without bread. They'll adamantly say that. And then we get them adapted to the ketogenic diet, and they have totally different perspective. That there's so many other enjoyable, pleasurable, delicious foods you can eat. It's all about trade-offs.
For sure.
Well, so you're talking about adaptation. For a lot of people, the so-called keto flu is a hurdle that they can't seem to overcome at the beginning. And the mental fog and fatigue that some people face when becoming fat adapted, just some people feels like it's too much for them. So what are your thoughts and what's your advice about this, Jeff?
Yeah, this keto flu is a hard concept for people to get their head around. So the keto flu is primarily an effect that is caused by low circulating volume, low plasma volume, because the ketogenic diet has a natriuretic effect, which means you have increased excretion of sodium in the urine. And also, where sodium goes, fluid goes. So you also have a diuretic effect associated with the ketogenic diet. Now, this is just a normal physiological response. And that's a good thing for most people, especially if you're carrying a little extra fluid or have edema, and a lot of obese diabetic people have that. So that results, in rapid weight loss, which is perceived as beneficial. So there's a good aspect to that for sure. But if you don't address it over time, the loss of that sodium and fluid causes a compensatory response in the body that is really a stress response. It's an adrenal stress. The cortisol, aldosterone go up, and the body tries to conserve sodium. And that's not a good thing. You'll lose muscle mass, and you'll have a host of mineral imbalances that cause cramping and other things. And so the keto flu and all these symptoms of dizziness, fainting, fatigue, even headache, constipation, it really relates back to not addressing the extra sodium that's lost. So, most people need to replace that with an extra gram or two on top of their normal sodium intake. And that's just your new sort of homeostasis in terms of sodium. You have to get used to getting comfortable with having extra sodium in the diet. If you don't, most people end up with some of those symptoms of the keto flu. But you can alleviate most of those by just consuming extra sodium.
Yeah,
making sure you get potassium too is important.
Another boogeyman, right? So when they say they don't feel good, they go to their physician and they said, I'm having the ketogenic diet and look what's become of me. And then the physician says, oh, that's a very dangerous diet. And then they say, but the experts, I heard the expert on Stem Talk say I need a lot more sodium. And then the physician really gives them the lecture.
Well, and actually more often what happens is people self-medicate. So what do you do when you have the keto flu and you feel tired? You're on this new diet and, you're doing it great, but you're just not replacing the extra sodium. So you get the keto flu and you feel awful. What do? You start to eat carbs. And guess what? You feel better, at least in terms of the keto flu.
Sure, it's proof.
Because now you're retaining the sodium because of the carbs and the insulin. So then that sort of reinforces the idea there's something inherently bad about the ketogenic diet that you cured with carbohydrate, whereas you could have cured it with extra sodium and then, you would have gone on to experience continued benefits of the low carb and the ketones. So it's a challenge to it's because it's a little complicated to go through that explanation with folks. And, and just like saturated fat, sodium's been demonized. It's crazy, but I mean, the dietary guidelines continue to advocate for low sodium diets for the entire population, despite pretty clear evidence that there's no benefit to that. In fact, there could be detriment of too low a sodium because of that stress response I was talking about. Anyway, just another one of the sort of nutrition fallacies out there that continue to get promoted.
Absolutely. And as you well know, fasting and time-restricted eating have become the latest rage in the dietary world and the dieting world. Fasting is being billed as an effective way to speed weight loss and get into ketosis. And of course, you will go into ketosis. That's the reason why we've evolved to have ketosis. But I understand that you have some reservations about protracted fasting. I don't mean brief fasts, but you have some reservations, I believe, about long fasts beyond 24 hours. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think, it sort of depends on how you operationally define fasting and time-restricted feeding and so forth, and how you practice it in the real world. But clearly with prolonged fasting beyond really 24 hours or so, you really start to get concerned about a couple things. One being just the lack of protein. And so you really start to go into more of a catabolic state after 24 hours where you see, increased urinary nitrogen excretion. And so you worry about the effects on muscle mass and long-term manifestations of losing muscle mass. The other is just if you're not consuming food over 24 plus hours, how are you getting all your micronutrients and ensuring you're getting the adequate sodium and potassium and magnesium and other essential micronutrients? And then, thirdly, I worry about, especially some of these people with the more addictive tendencies that, when you come out of the fast and you're just ravagingly hungry, do people go off the wagon and you just end up, over consuming carbs and having this hyperinsulinic response and some of the collateral damage that might be associated with that. So, it does concern me, but, alternatively, the time-restricted feeding, I don't generally have a problem with. I think most people over time who have, sort of mastered the ketogenic diet end up just by nature of the high satiety value attributed to the diet, do some form of time-restricted feeding, whether they're doing it intentionally or not, just because you're not hungry. So most people only eat a couple times a day, because you have such good fuel flow with fatty acid availability and ketones being plentiful that you can miss a meal and you're not falling off an energy cliff. So most people only eat a couple times a day anyway. So you end up sort of time-restricted feeding, whether you're doing it intentionally or not. And that's fine, I think. So I don't view the time-restricted feeding as an alternative. It's kind of an interesting evolution of different diet approaches. I sometimes think it's, people don't want to embrace the ketogenic diet because there's still some connotation that it's a fad diet. So they invent other ways of other terms to describe it, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And they don't want to eat or admit that they're eating a relatively high-fat diet. So one of my concerns with the fasting approaches, and I agree with everything you just said, right? A person that's long-term on a ketogenic diet almost automatically is doing time-restricted eating. Not compulsively, but just naturally, because they're not hungry. But one of the things I do see in discussion and questions we get sometimes sent to STEM Talk is, okay, ketogenic diet's really hard, so I'm going to do time-restricted eating and eat anything I want, because after all, this is the new craze, and you don't have to have any particular macronutrient ratio. And I don't think that's a good thing, and I think it'll bring harm to some people.
Yeah, I'm not convinced there's good evidence for that either, Ken. I don't think it addresses some of the, real metabolic impairments that people with diabetes have, for example. And it's a little bit, like playing with fire if you're allowing unrestricted carb intake during those limited times you are eating. So, I'd be wary of that.
And your first point about putting your body in a catabolic state with a long fast, I think is also a good one, and it's one that Vivian Lowe also made in her interview. I think she's even less enamored of it than you are, but that was one of her main points as well.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about people getting onto the ketogenic diet, something else we've seen right now are grocery shelves that are just full of new products that advertise themselves as keto breads and keto donuts and keto bagels, keto ice cream. So Jeff, we're curious about your thoughts on this flood of keto products that we're seeing.
Yeah, it is. It's noticeable for sure. And I guess, we've talked about the exponential increase in research interest in this topic, but I don't think we've explicitly stated there's been a sort of parallel explosion in popular interest in ketogenic diets. And I'm thrilled for that, because, for the last 15 years, it's been a pretty lonely existence being one of few investigators studying this back in the early 2000s and late 1990s. But, there's kind of a double-edged sword with this new popular interest. We are shining more light on ketogenic nutrition and low-carb nutrition. But also, there's a lot of charlatans out there now coming out of the closet. And we have all these weird variants of ketogenic diets that aren't really scientifically grounded. And, of course, the food industry is responding to consumer demands. So, as you said, I was walking through the Costco last week, and I couldn't believe how many low-carb products and keto products there were. It's like every aisle had some, version of low-carb for what used to be just a, high-carb junk food. And, that's also a mixed bag, because I don't think a lot of the formulations of these keto products are ideal or even healthy. Some are good, though. So there is, a positive sort of spin on this, in that there are more quality products, and in general, there's more accessibility to low carb foods in the grocery store, in the airports, and so that's overall a good trend. But people still need to scrutinize labels and be careful not to succumb to the labeling just because it says low carb or sugar free or keto friendly on the label doesn't mean it's actually that or that it's healthy for you. So it's still a bit of a minefield out there, and a toxic, food landscape that we have to navigate every day. But overall, it's a good trend. It means consumers are demanding low carb products, and over time, I'm hopeful that the quality of the products will improve.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it demonstrates the food industry's ability to adapt to any trend, produce some good but mostly awful products that bear the label. You remember low salt, low fat, on and on and on, and now it's keto.
Yeah, and I haven't said this either, but I really think it's important to emphasize that a ketogenic diet is based primarily, or exclusively on just good old-fashioned whole foods. You don't have to get super fancy with specialty keto products. Now, they can be helpful sometimes, and to cases where you just want a little break. But the foundation of the diet is really whole food based.
It's all stuff your grandmother would have recognized. And it's amazing. They knew all of this a long time ago. Just household wisdom, in the 50s and 60s, in the late 60s and early 70s, I was a wrestler, and none of this was mysterious then. We were all told, if you want to make weight, you're not going to eat those carbs. You're not eating those potatoes. And nobody used the phrase ketogenic, but everyone sort of knew it.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ken, because you can make a strong case. If we just went back to those times, we'd make a huge dent in our obesity, diabetes epidemic. So in many ways, all the science and, public policy that started really in the 70s, took root in the 80s, 90s, and right up to, contemporary times now. That's all been a massive experiment on this country that we are all participants in. We didn't sign a consent form.
Yeah.
And it's been an epic failure by any measure, but there's no data safety monitoring board that's going to pull the plug on this. And that's the problem. No one wants to be accountable. And that's, it's taken now decades. We've got 20 years of accumulation of science supporting low carb, and yet it's completely ignored in the dietary guidelines.
No.
So this isn't encouraged. It's an option for people, and it's unscientific. It's criminal, I think, because a lot of people are suffering unnecessarily, and it's got to change eventually. And we're getting close to that point in time, I think. But it's not an easy thing to turn this ship around.
It seems like increasingly there's zero accountability in the proclamations and then the negative results of our public health officials. We just went through 2 years of that or 3 years of it, and it doesn't seem to be getting better in my view.
No, it's not, and that's despite a huge amount of science and a lot of people, even working on the policy side of things too. It's very complicated and challenging and frustrating.
Well, Jeff, I would have to say you are a walking testimonial for ketogenic and low-carb diets. And I think you've been following a low-carb diet for more than 20 years. And over that time, you've maintained a healthy body weight and a healthy lipid profile, as you've talked about in the past. I've also heard that you talk about how the diet gives you an amazing level of focus and energy. Can you share with our listeners what your daily dietary intake looks like, and then also how that diet benefits you?
Yeah, well, thanks, Dawn. And Ken, I know you've been on a low-carb diet, ketogenic diet for quite a long time too.
Ken's another walking testimonial.
So, but I guess what I would say first is, the focus should not be on me or Ken in terms of what we do. That, we have way too much emphasis on N-of-1, people claiming that what works for them works for everyone else, and they get on their soapbox and preach because we got no shortage of experts in nutrition, mostly celebrities and people who have diet books. And, instead we should be focusing on the scientific evidence and basing our nutrition policy on that evidence as best we can, as imperfect as it may be. But in the spirit of directly answering your question, I do attempt to stay in nutritional ketosis most of the time. I monitor that with finger stick blood measures of ketones. I'm not perfect, and like many people, I have a fatal romance with carbs, so occasionally I'll succumb to the temptations of a good carb-induced dopamine rush. But, as I get older and less carb tolerant and more concerned with aging gracefully, those events are far and few between now. I tend to eat twice a day, usually late morning or early afternoon. I'm not a breakfast person. I feel great in the morning on an empty stomach and a little caffeine. And then again, I'll eat dinner 4 or 6 hours after that. So I guess I'm practicing time-restricted feeding, although I never intended to. And to stay in ketosis, that means my carb intake is generally 40, 50 grams per day, and protein probably 100, 120 grams per day, which means I eat a lot of fat because I'm not trying to lose weight, so I have to maintain my weight. So it's a very high-fat diet, which means I enjoy a lot of delicious sauces and dressings that I put on a variety of different non-starchy vegetables and different types of meat. So, I love food. I'm a foodie, and I look forward to my meals. I get a lot of enjoyment from them, and I can have, maximal experience with food on a ketogenic diet without bread, without pasta, without cereal, without a lot of fruit. It's very sustainable for me. I'll eat this way the rest of my life. then I love to cook too and experiment. So there's plenty of opportunity to be creative and experiment with different dishes and modifications of recipes. I don't think a lot of people really appreciate that when they think of ketogenic diets in particular, where they really think they're just so restrictive and you have to, give up all that pleasure that you may have with food. And that's just definitely not the case.
And considering all the amazing research that you've shared, we're curious, Jeff, over the next decade, where do you see the field of ketogenic research going? And will the official dietary recommendations change? And I know you published a recent scientific article with several prominent co-authors that was titled Alternative Dietary Patterns for Americans, Low Carbohydrate Diets. So maybe as part of your answer to this question, could you tell us about this work as well, and also your thoughts on the future, as I was asking?
Yeah, I'm very excited about the future. So, the genie's out of the bottle. So the incredible momentum we are witnessing in ketogenic science is going to continue for the next decade and beyond. I'm absolutely convinced of that. We can't go backwards from here. Now, it's good. Science is an incredibly slow process, so it's going to take time to do the many clinical trials that need to be done, and that's going to happen over this next decade and beyond. There's a lot of long-term studies that need to be done in different populations and so forth. But we're not going backwards like we did when we were in the 60s and had some really great low-carb science, and then everything halted for the next 30 years. That's not going to happen. So we're going to see a lot of new data come out over the next decade. That's going to be in a lot of new areas. I mean, we have a lot in diabetes. You'll see continued work there. But we're going to see these studies in heart disease, in cancer, in neurology, in different clinical populations. We're going to see clinical trials now be done, and we're going to have data to make more definitive conclusions on whether or not they're effective or not, and whether or not they're safe, and what they do and what they don't do. So that's going to be, all coming out over the next 10 years. I predict the results will be positive, but as a scientist, that's why you do research. You have to be open to the fact that, they won't be positive. So we'll find out. We do have enough evidence now that they're safe, generally safe. And so there's no reason we can't be applying these in different clinical populations with appropriate monitoring. And that's where, I see just tremendous advances too, outside of the research and clinical and scientific interest. We're just going to see continued popularity of low carb diets, continued availability of low carb products. And then to your question about policy, that's hard to predict because it's so hard to change policy, despite heroic efforts by people like Nina Teicholz and the Nutrition Coalition, who've been really just putting heroic efforts forward, calling out the lack of scientific rigor in the guideline process. And I do see small progress. They've just announced the Scientific Dietary Guideline Committee. There's a lot of pressure to acknowledge the literature on low-carb science. This is for the 2025 dietary guidelines. So they happen every 5 years. I'm hopeful there'll maybe be some small changes in 2025. Maybe that's the optimist in me. The realist might predict 2030s where we see maybe some big changes. But like the American Diabetes Association has already acknowledged low carb is a credible option for diabetics. That's a huge progress. And American Heart is somewhat open to it. So, baby steps. We are making some progress in the clinical use of ketogenic diets, but we do need to change the dietary guidelines because despite the fact people may never read what the dietary guidelines are in the scientific report, it affects everybody through their public programs, whether it's, school lunch program or WIC program. It affects what food manufacturers make. It affects what we teach dietitians and healthcare professionals. So we have to change it eventually in order to completely, embrace the science and the application of this. But, it's a tough process, but we are chipping away at it. And I think in the next decade, so if you say 2030, I think we've got a good chance of maybe having this really embraced as an option in the dietary guidelines. And that's what that paper was all about. It presented a really nice, fairly comprehensive overview of the state of the science in low-carb nutrition. And then the second section talked about the application and formulation of a low-carb and ketogenic diet. So, I think it's a powerful piece in terms of the content, demonstrating how strong the science is and why it should be considered an option in the dietary guidelines, along with other options like Mediterranean diet, vegetarian, and so forth. Currently, it's not even regarded and mentioned as an option. So that's all we're saying. And the science more than supports that. So it's a nice article. And as you said, there are a lot of very high level scientists that, signed on to, be co-authors on that with me.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Jeff. Well, Jeff, as always, we loved having you on the podcast and loved having a chance to chat with you today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Ken. I really appreciate you having me back.
Oh, we enjoyed it, Jeff. And as always, you were great.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
So, Ken, when we interviewed Jeff back in 2017, I remember Jeff talking about how much of the debate about carbohydrate restriction back then had been largely negative and one-sided and also driven more by cultural bias than science. And it's really amazing to look back and see how far ketogenic diets, intermittent fasting, and other carbohydrate-restricted diets have come in terms of acceptance within the medical and also in the research community since the 1970s.
As I mentioned in the beginning of this interview, Jeff has generated more scientific data and published more research on ketogenic diets than anyone I know. As we discussed during our interview, Jeff is engaged in several potentially groundbreaking studies. Jeff is a good friend who has already improved the lives of millions of people in helping them use a ketogenic diet to reverse their type 2 diabetes.
Such excellent work that he's doing and will continue to do. And if you enjoyed this interview as much as Ken and I did, we invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes at stemtalk.us. This is Dawn Carnegie signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.